Alrighty, let me get this up here. So, yesterday we had looked at various factors that were sort of pushing America towards war. The the general issues with Spain, um, specifically as regarded the island of Cuba and American business interest in Cuba, as well as, quite frankly, a humanitarian interest in just the abysmal treatment of the Cubans by the Spanish. But what we're going to look at today is, you know, why, why a war? What exactly would a war mean for America? So it's not just like, you look at a situation and go, um, I don't like the way that you're treating those people. I'm going to go to war with you. Or I'm making a lot of money on sugar, but I can make a lot more money than that if I just went to war with you. That really doesn't exactly seem to be an explanation, at least in my world. Maybe it is to some degree. So let's look at a couple of factors here. What exactly does war mean? Well, the benefits of war. In 1893, at the Chicago World's Fair, one of the chief attractions of the fair were a rotating series of lectures by very well known, very influential people of the day. And one of the premier guests, one of the most important peeps at the fair, I believe it was at the U.S. government building, was Frederick Jackson Turner, historian and professor from the University of Wisconsin-Madison. Now, while you guys have never heard of him, okay, it's probably a good guess to say that if you had been alive even 100 years ago, maybe slightly more, there's a better chance you would have known who Frederick Jackson Turner was. He was the most well-regarded, most widely known, most famous historian of the late 19th century. His views, his beliefs, um, the way that he approached teaching the subject really influenced much of America. And that may seem to say, be like, well, yeah, right, how would he do that? Every major college in the country and every major university in the country, on faculty in their history department, had people who had been educated by Frederick Jackson Turner, which meant that those people, his students, his former students, were in some respects sort of like his disciples. Here's a dirty little secret in case you didn't know it, but many of us as teachers, we really can look back at one or two teachers who greatly impacted us. And when we consciously decided to engage in this, possibly otherwise completely profitless endeavor, we really looked back at those teachers and the way that they instructed us, and that formed who we were and who we are as teachers. The same is of Frederick Jackson Turner. His beliefs and his policies and ideas really formed the backbone of most American universities at the time. And in 1893, Turner was a featured speaker and presenter talking about the significance or the changes of the United States and what America's future was going to look like. He is one of the people who really pushed this idea that there was something unique and different about America, that this is the idea of exceptionalism we had talked about before that had come out of the fair. But more specifically, Frederick Jackson Turner had an actual hypothesis that that he was putting forward at the fair, at the expo. And like many people who go out on speaking tours, there's a level there where he's hawking books and ideas. Well, the subject matter of his talks had to do with American exceptionalism, what made America exceptional, and and what the future looked like for America. And he had a hypothesis. And remember, a hypothesis is like an educated guess. His hypothesis was that looking back over the history of America, America's rapid growth and development, and quite frankly, its evolution as a great country, owed itself to the concept of manifest destiny and the belief that America needed to continue to expand. And what Turner proposed was that now in 1893 that America had hit manifest destiny, that we stretched from sea to shining sea and coast to coast, and heck, we owned a giant chunk of land in the Pacific Northwest that was not even connected to us. But we had reached the limits of what we were capable of unless we found a new way to keep expanding. And the only way that that could happen was to go beyond outside of America. We had already done it somewhat by acquiring Alaska, and we owned a couple of dinky little patches of islands in the middle of nowhere in the Pacific Ocean. But what Turner proposes is that if America wants to continue to be great and continue to evolve and continue to be special, we need to start taking over other countries because this is what other nations did. And if we truly want to be considered like Britain, France, the newly emerging German state, um, you know, we needed to become a legitimate world power. And that meant that we needed an empire. Then there's the issue of William McKinley. McKinley wants Spain gone. In his mind, they have far outlived their stay in the Western Hemisphere. They were a morally bankrupt country to some degree, and they were essentially like acting like bullies. Also, for McKinley, is the reality that there is a military aspect to this that really needs to be addressed. And that aspect is that with our new, albeit flawed, Navy, we need to provide greater protection for ourselves. And in the Atlantic, that means that we need bases that we can launch naval strike forces from. Those bases should be located in the Caribbean. There's really nowhere in the Caribbean to put them, however. And similarly, in the Pacific Ocean, the United States was the only major country that had no base in the Pacific. We actually were renting space from the British in Hong Kong for the U.S. Pacific Fleet. A war with Spain would actually do both of these because in the Caribbean, Spain had Cuba and Puerto Rico. In the Pacific, they had Guam, and more importantly, they controlled the Philippines. Those areas would give us the bases that we needed. We just needed to get them away from Spain. Now, war would be a way to do this, but McKinley doesn't want to go to war. Okay, McKinley is not a coward, nor is he of the belief that America can't win. But McKinley is the last president who had seen battle in the Civil War. He was a Civil War veteran. But unlike the other guys, that we've talked about, like Hayes or Garfield or, specifically Grant. Hayes, I mean, McKinley had entered the Army as a private. He did not enter the Army as an officer. He rose through the ranks as being a common everyday soldier. But the very first thing that he got thrown into when he was just a regular, like, fresh private, just joined the Army, was the Battle of Antietam, which, if you guys remember from last year, is a horrible battle that saw literally like rivers of blood and piles of dead bodies. And it is still, to this day, the highest one-day death total for in the U.S. history for the Army. This was the battle that introduced McKinley to war, and he does not want to subject anybody else to that. So instead, what McKinley really is hoping to do is to engage in a time-honored practice in America, and that's simply to basically buy what we want and make Spain just go away. It's essentially, how much money is it going to take to make you go away from me? That's what McKinley's looking at. Now, maybe you might find this odd, but the Democrats are really in support of war. They really want war. And that's because the Democratic Party, which is now swept up in this great movement of progressive liberalism, the William Jennings Bryan Cross of Gold Democrats, the party of the common people, of the little man, of the worker, of the farmer, of the poor. They view war as a way to spread the ideas that they are now embracing. We can go and we can, liberate Cuba from its oppression, and then we can get Cuba to understand why progressivism is the way to go and really help the Cubans become who they are meant to be as a group of progressive thinking leftists. So it becomes kind of a struggle for McKinley because there's a lot of different forces pushing and tugging at him with this. Now, it's also safe to say that there is no love lost whatsoever between the United States and Spain. We are on a very uneasy relationship. The U.S. government and the Spanish government more or less get along. But the people of the United States really don't have a very good opinion of the Spanish. Now, some of this, we go back and look at something like the Virginius affair, and that certainly did contribute to it, as well as the way that Spain deals with the Cubans on a regular basis. But there's other things. We briefly talked about this in class, but there is the great insult of 1893. So in addition to sending us the Nina Pinta and Santa Maria to commemorate Columbus, the Spanish sent this charming young lady, the very debonair, sweet, and attractive Princess Eulalia, the 15-year-old, I think it was 15-year-old crown princess of Spain, who, when she came to Chicago to celebrate the World's Fair, she promptly began her time in Chicago by insulting all the women and saying they were fat, ugly, stupid, and had no fashion sense, then said America was a horrible place, and spent her time, instead of doing what she was supposed to in representing Spain, she gallivanted around the Midway like girls gone wild, spending her time smoking, belly dancing, drinking, and riding the Ferris wheel. The people of Chicago were not too happy about this, and they really held that against the Spanish. And there are two newspapers in particular, William Randolph Hearst's New York Journal and Joseph Pulitzer's New York World, that specialized in constantly egging on America's dislike of Spain. This was something called yellow journalism. Yellow journalism was what we now would refer to as disinformation or fake news. They specialized in very graphic, lurid stories with very sort of clickbaity headlines that really were designed to sell newspapers. And both Hearst and Pulitzer were very big supporters of progressivism, and they wanted a war with Spain to liberate the Cuban people who legitimately were being oppressed and to spread progressive ideas, um, much like the Democrats in Congress did. So when in 1895 a new round of revolts began in Cuba, Hearst and Pulitzer, and ironically enough, Joseph Pulitzer, you may have heard that name before. He is there is the most prestigious prize in journalism is named after him. A guy who specialized in publishing disinformation and fake news. I'm just going to leave it at that. So when the new round of revolts began in 1895, Hearst and Pulitzer began publishing stories of horrendous atrocities committed in Cuba. Now, what prompted this was a change in the Cuban policy on the part of Spain. In years prior, when the revolts broke out, what would happen would be that the Spanish would send in an army, they would subdue the Cubans, they would put down the revolt, and everything would kind of go back to normal. And then a few years later, another revolt would break out. Well, in 1895, the Spanish changed their policy. They sent in a military leader named Weyler, who began instituting a policy of concentration camps. He built camps all over Cuba. And because they couldn't exactly figure out who the rebels and the leaders were in Cuba, they simply dumped all the Cubans into these camps. 20, 30,000 of them at a time. They would literally put an entire city of Cubans into a small confined area under heavy guard where these people would lack basic food, water, areas to be able to have toilet facilities, and they were getting sick and dying in large numbers from starvation or malnutrition or dehydration or disease. This is the kind of thing that was being put out to the American people. This political cartoon here. So in this political cartoon, you have the Cubans represented by this horribly abused little child. And you will notice that the child who is Cuba is chained to Spanish rule, with Spain's motto of barbarity, cruelty, assassination, and murder being emblazoned at the top. In the background, you can see a Red Cross hospital on fire and burning. Over here, you see a young Cuban, perhaps even maybe, oh, never mind, it's not even a Cuban, it's an American, reminding us of the Virginius incident, who's being killed by the Spanish. Lady Liberty is reaching out. The people of America are reaching out to help the poor, helpless Cuban people. But while our citizens are dying and hospitals are burning and, all sorts of other areas are being destroyed by this revolution, by these evil, cruel Spanish people who are still enforcing barbaric 16th century life and methods on people. Here's the government, hands tied, unable to do anything. A battleship sitting there, completely useless, not doing anything. America, the fortress, really on the footsteps and on the doorstep of Cuba, does nothing. This is the kind of stuff that would be like regularly put out by Hearst and Pulitzer. There's also the very real possibility that there could be an unintended consequence of the Cuban revolt. The harsh lockdowns meant a lack of workers to harvest the sugar. For a U.S. economy that was just beginning to recover from the Panic of 1893, these revolts threatened our ability to recover from our own problems. Now, in 1896, when McKinley was elected, Hearst and Pulitzer went after him mercilessly. They hated him. They were, in fact, two of the only newspapers that didn't endorse McKinley over William Jennings Bryan. They accused McKinley of being a coward, that he was afraid to take on the Spanish, that he maybe even secretly supported the evil that they were doing. And every day, Hearst and Pulitzer would publish stories of the atrocities being committed against the Cubans. It sold loads of newspapers. And it really got the vast majority of Americans who got their information from these newspapers to begin to support the idea of going to war with Spain to stop the horror of what was going on in Cuba. Okay, we will pick this up tomorrow. I am going to post a video about what yellow journalism is and its character traits and how it operates that you will need to watch and take notes on. But that's it for today on this. Peace and love. Peace and love.